Working in the homeless sector can be rewarding, helping people overcome adversity, improve their situations, establish a home and make a fresh start.
I think what I like most really about working with homeless people is that, I mean, it sounds a bit trite, but it is actually quite challenging and it is really varied.
You meet people and they may not be the easiest people to establish rapport or trust with. But there is a satisfaction when you can manage to do that and you can gain their trust.
What I find probably most rewarding around my work with these people is the actual contact, you know, that kind of person-to-person contact.
A lot of really, really good things happen in this sector. I mean, they really good things, but it can be very rough at times, it can be very disheartening, and it's those times I think that you need to really focus on the good and, you know, the effectiveness of your work, and you need to cling to those victories, because if you don't, you know, then there's a very good chance that your motivation and your enthusiasm and your heart for this work, that will perish, and I think that is one of the greatest losses.
Being homeless is dangerous. Many homeless people experience trauma and illness and engage in risky behaviour like dangerous levels of drug and alcohol abuse. Those who work with homeless people inevitably encounter traumatised people and even the deaths of people with whom they work.
I've been around death for over 30 years in the caring profession. This is a risk for people who are homeless. Death can occur. And, you know, and then the realisation, you know, I suppose there's the questions I have to ask myself, did I do everything I possibly could for them? And in most instances I would say yes. And then there's the acceptance that for people who sleep, rough death can occur for some of them.
In some ways, given the chaotic lives that some of the people that you work with live, that it's always a possibility that given the polydrug use, the rough sleeping, the chances are that people can die.
I do think that there is a need to really open up a lot more discussion about, you know, this whole idea of experiencing death. I would just, you know, I'd like to see, I suppose, more opportunities to look at, you know, how people respond, because it is a little bit of a taboo subject. People really don't talk about it that much, and we all acknowledge it and we go through it, but we just don't get the time to really tease through the issue, I guess.
Homeless sector workers can encounter death in many ways. Directly, and perhaps most confronting, discovering a body. People also encounter death through word of mouth, or in the context of caring for someone who is ill or dying. Some service users suffer assault, murder, suicide, overdose, and sometimes the cause of death is unclear. These different forms of death and ways of encountering death demand different responses.
I guess the first time I would have encountered harm befalling somebody in terms of sudden death would have been when I was working in hostels. You know, you would see somebody off to bed at night, and then perhaps you'd go to call them in the morning, and suddenly there was no response.
There was a young man who we'd just started to work with, who was quite a sober, fit young fellow with some mental health problems. He according to him, he was refused admission to a wet shelter one evening because he was not intoxicated, and he slept rough and had a very difficult night. The next day he was found dead in a park by some children walking to school, and he was surrounded by bottles. We later found out that he had died by aspirating his own vomit.
We came in on a Monday morning and he was found dead in his apartment on the couch. He looked like he was asleep, and that would be kind of a position you'd often find him in, sort of curled up on the couch asleep in front of the TV. But this morning, unfortunately, he'd had some sort of brain hemorrhage and he died suddenly.
I think I was only 3 or 4 weeks in Dublin AIDS Alliance when I got a call from a worker in Ballymun about a girl that I'd known just really for a couple of weeks, and she had died in a squat. And it was, you know, as I said, very early in my career, and this person asked me to come out and could I deal with her family. And when I went out, the woman was in the body bag, and she was being brought out of the squat, and her, I think she was probably maybe 6 or 7-year-old daughter, had just come across the scene, and she saw her mother in the body bag, and she just leapt on the body trying to unzip the bag because she kept screaming that her mother couldn't breathe.
Encountering death can provoke a range of thoughts and feelings. People may feel angry, sad, guilty, remorseful, and sometimes people are emotionally unaffected. People often experience shock initially, and other emotions may be triggered days or even weeks later.
I was shocked to hear it, even though it can be expected that this can happen, but it's still a shock.
I remember just going on the bus home, just literally being in shock, and I didn't come back to work. I went straight home, and I just found myself that night literally just kind of wandering around my room, unable to kind of think or do anything, and it was very difficult. And it wasn't really till the next day when I got into work that I kind of really, almost for about 2 hours, sat down with the nearest person I could find, I think, and just sort of walked through that whole incident.
When it's a family member or a close friend or somebody outside of work, you know how you're supposed to deal with grief, but when it's something to do at work, you're the professional, so you're kind of like, well, I need to take a step back from this and say, well, I shouldn't be affected, but I am a human being, so I am affected.
People frequently do have conflicted thoughts and may blame themselves, the organisation, or others for failing to prevent death.
Myself as a manager, I felt somewhat responsible in terms of the service failing this individual, letting him down. I think some of my colleagues felt as if this was a personal failing. There was a lot of blame and recrimination. So we not only felt personally responsible, but there were times when we blamed other services for letting this fellow down.
When death occurs within services, clear policies and procedures can be helpful to guide behaviour and provide a sense of purpose.
We have a policy and procedure in place within the organisation for dealing with a death, and there's procedures to be followed. I would have to come back to the office and I would have to write out what we would call an incident report, which would take me through the events that led up to the death and what I would need to do next.
Culture plays an important role in how death is marked and people's lives are memorialised or remembered. Homeless sector workers sometimes cannot engage in the usual rituals associated with death and mourning. Nevertheless, it is important that death is marked respectfully and people find personal and collective ways to do this.
I chatted with my colleague, and then as a team it was also acknowledged and talked about. One of my colleagues and we just went and we lit a candle in a church.
We came together as a team and we spoke a lot in detail about him and just had our own little memorial service as a group. We'd always attend the funeral if possible. Sometimes people have the funerals are being in the west of Ireland or something, and it's just not feasible for everybody to go. So where possible, we would attend the funeral.
Service users can sometimes respond with risk-taking behaviour when a friend or acquaintance dies. Professionals can also be vulnerable to the adverse effects of trauma. Caring can make them more vulnerable through identifying with the service user, as can the accumulation of stress and personal issues in their own lives.
In college, I learned there's no right or wrong to feelings, they just are. The more you try to control them, the more they'll control the person. It's important to be able to speak about feelings, and for the listener to be aware that tomorrow he may feel differently about it. Even sometimes we might need to vent a bit, or we might need to express feelings of anger. We might get it out of the system as such. It just helps in grounding one's perspective then.
All members of our team received clinical supervision, and whereby they worked with somebody from their discipline who wasn't working directly in the service, who would review their practice with them. We also had regular practice reviews, but I think all of us increased the frequency of our supervision after the death of this fellow.
I think there is an onus on organisations to be particularly sensitive to new workers, because I think new workers haven't quite exercised that grief muscle, I suppose, so to speak, and that they need to know that, you know, that people may not have experienced something like this before, and they may be a little apprehensive about how to deal with it. For example, they may think, well, I'd like to maybe mark the death this way, but because they're new in the organisation, they may feel a little uncomfortable going to a line manager and saying, well, I know that we've done it this way, or you've done it this way, can we kind of think about doing this, you know? So I think, again, organisations need to be a little more sensitive when somebody new in the organisation or new to the field experiences a death.
To endure encounters with trauma and death, it is important that people look after themselves and each other. People need to give voice to conflicted thoughts and feelings and deal with personal issues that are made raw through encountering death and dying. Mobilising supportive peer networks, formal or informal debriefing with colleagues, personal therapy and practice supervision can help to maintain well-being.
I think one of the things where people can kind of protect themselves, I guess, and deal with issues of death is, I would say, to talk about it, you know, to kind of clear up the kind of the thoughts and the feelings. And I would advise people to do that as quickly as possible. And usually some form of debrief is pretty good because I think that deals with the immediate. And then I think people have the right to a counselling service outside of that.
We do become traumatised, you know, through the work that we do. So it is important, I think, that people actually have do things in their recreational time that really clearly separates them from that trauma and that work, that sustains them, that enriches them.
I would have put in place, not long after I started, sort of a staff support sessions, and in those sessions we'd kind of reflect on what's gone on in the last maybe 2 weeks or month and see how it's affected people.
Sometimes when confronted with the death of service users, it's hard to find much that is positive about the experience. Dealing with death is about positively framing the person's life, death and homeless sector work. A positive frame is created when people come to see death as a professional loss rather than a personal one. See failings or failures as opportunities for professional improvement rather than as personal flaws.
There's a proverb I really like. It's actually a biblical proverb, but it goes something like, you know, for want of a vision or for lack of a vision, people perish. And I think that's particularly true of frontline workers. I think you have to have a vision for what you're doing. You have to focus on the good.
There's also that kind of ability to reach out and to touch somebody, you know, just to touch somebody's life in a positive way. And it's that kind of sense of satisfaction, you know. Once I feel and know I have done everything I possibly could, then I also have to accept the risks.
even when death is tinged with brutality, is unjust or seems senseless, people need to extract something good from it, even if it is a renewed commitment to fight injustice or improve services.
I think we all came to see that we perhaps could not have prevented this. We didn't foresee it, and we couldn't have prevented this from occurring. It certainly caused us to rethink notions of risk and how we would deal with risky situations in future.
Just realizing and knowing that you are making a difference in some ways is really, really important. So I guess that's one of the things that I do. I have to hope.